Welcome back to the Point of Order podcast, an inside look at California politics and the state legislature. I am your host, Assemblyman Josh Hoover, and excited to be joined again, once again, to talk about the May revise and the budget. Tom Sheehy, welcome back to the program, Tom.
Hey, Josh, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me back. I really appreciate it and enjoy your podcast.
Absolutely. So why don't you remind the listeners, just very briefly, your background. Why do you love talking about the budget so much?
Sure, I appreciate that. So I've been an advocate for almost 20 years, and I've done a lot of advocacy in the budget area. But before that, I was staff in the legislature for about 10 years, and I was also staff in the executive branch for 9 years. And when I was in the executive branch, I worked for Governor Schwarzenegger. I was his chief deputy, director of finance, and so I had really the privilege and honor to staff the governor directly on a lot of fiscal issues, especially when we were going into the Great Recession in the 07 to 09 time period. Really, as difficult as it was for us to go through that as a fiscal geek, it was sort of a fascinating time because, I mean, we really had to roll our sleeves up and figure out how to keep the state solvent. Interesting note, just as a sidebar, at that time when Schwarzenegger was governor, we went into the Great Recession. He, of course, had a big budget problem. One of the issues besides budget that was such a challenge was cash management. The state's cash reserves across the board were very, very low. We have a budget problem now, which we'll talk about more later, the structural budget problem. But the difference is for Governor Newsom and probably his successor is that the state doesn't have a big cash problem. So there is a difference between how much cash is on hand and the actual budget situation. And I would argue that we're in much better shape today than we were when Schwarzenegger was governor.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
On that note, not to get into the numbers of the budget yet, but in terms of approach, right, between Governor Schwarzenegger and Governor Newsom, what are some of the differences that you see in terms of how they approach the budget?
Well, Schwarzenegger was a Republican, but I called him an anti-tax Democrat. I mean, his policy on social and environmental issues were pretty much in alignment, I'd say, with the Democrat caucus and a lot of California. But on spending issues and on tax issues, he was far more conservative. And I would say the biggest difference between Schwarzenegger and Newsom in terms of how they're managing things is Schwarzenegger pushed much harder to get budget cuts in social service programs and education. I mean, that's where the money's spent. It's not that you want to cut education. Nobody wants to cut education.
Of course.
Nobody wants to cut health care to poor people. But you got to go where the money is. And Schwarzenegger was willing to propose a lot more by way of cuts. He was much more resistant to proposing tax increases. And so this isn't meant to be a hit on Governor Newsom. He's a Democrat, and the Democrats have a supermajority. So I think he's reflecting those values. But that would be the biggest difference I'd see.
Sure. Yeah. No, it's a great point, and that's really interesting. It's funny. You'll get a kick out of this. I actually showed my youngest son. He's 12, so he's not like a child, but middle schooler. His first R-rated movie recently.
Okay. How did that go?
It went pretty good. It was The Terminator.
Oh, okay.
Which,
it's a lot of violence in that movie.
Yeah, although, the 1980s violence, it doesn't look nearly as scary as
That's true.
stuff today.
Did you tell him that guy had been governor?
I did. So there's that opening scene where Schwarzenegger walks out naked into the
the light of day.
Into the world, and I'm like, that guy used to be the governor of California. He's like, what? Yeah. What are you talking about?
Yeah.
It was pretty hilarious. But I will say the one-liners in that movie and the second one were a big hit with my 12-year-old.
Good.
So he loved all the little funny one-liners.
I'm glad that the younger generation is picking up on that. Those were fun movies.
No, they really were. But I got a kick out of it, and it was fun watching our governor on the screen. I haven't seen one of his movies in a while. And anything else going on in your world before we jump into some of the stories of the week? I mean, anything else that you've been noticing this year?
I appreciate the question. I know you're going to talk a little bit about suspense from a client standpoint, practice standpoint. That, of course, was a major milestone last week. And I don't think there's a lot of surprise. Well, no, I'm going to reserve and say there was one big surprise in the May revise, but other than that, not too many other surprises. And looking forward to summer rolling around. We want to get back in our pool and do some more barbecuing.
Yeah, there you go.
And just try to enjoy life as much as we can.
I love it. That's great. And we definitely have, I would say, a month and a half more of a really busy season here in the legislature before we break in July.
Yep.
I know a lot of people looking forward to that break, but it's going to be jam-packed, I think, the next few weeks with
second House policy bills.
Right. Yeah, we got House of Origin deadline coming up in about a week, where every single bill introduced in the Senate and Assembly need to pass out of those houses.
Yeah.
And then we're going to be jumping right into our bills in the other house.
Right.
So it is it's certainly, from my perspective, it's a very busy time. I still have a lot of pieces of legislation moving forward, which is a good thing.
You mean they didn't get them all?
They didn't get them all. We've got about 8 or 10 moving forward. So, and already working with Senate committees on getting those out. So,
well, next week you're going to have at least 4 heavy days on the floor.
Oh yeah.
Get through all those bills.
Yeah. And we're meeting 2 more times this week, so we'll see.
That's right. Today's only Tuesday.
I think this might actually come out Thursday, which is going to be our next floor day.
Okay.
So I think a couple stories, because I really want to dive into the budget and make this mostly about that. But a couple things I had to mention. I think the first off the top is, at the same exact time, almost, maybe a little after, as the May revise was being announced, I was sitting in a chair in the Appropriations Committee as the new vice chair of the Appropriations Committee, where we went through our Assembly bill suspense file, which, to be honest with you, I mean, you've been around a long time, but for the listeners, it's, basically, it's one of the weirdest committee experiences I think you can have, because unlike a traditional committee where you present a bill, you debate the bill, opposition and support speak on the bill, and then you vote on the bill, it's just, there's so many bills that day that have been held on suspense for cost reasons that the chair just reads what gets out and what doesn't, and we follow along and share our Republican votes with her as we go through that process, and you sort of learn what lives and dies that day in the legislation. So what were your sort of takeaways from appropriations, and what were some of the numbers that you saw come out of there?
Oh, thanks for asking. So, if you look at the 2 houses combined, going into last Thursday's appropriation hearings, there were approximately, not quite, but approximately 1,000 bills on suspense. I think it was like 979, right around there, about 1,000 bills. About 250 of them were held, and the rest of them were referred to the floor. So the chairs in the 2 houses stopped about 25% of the legislation. And as you noted, many of those decisions were made based upon cost. The state's got a significant budget challenge we're going to talk about more, so I think that was a big factor. But as you also know, past the fiscal issue, the main reason for having a suspense file is it allows you to kill your colleagues' bills without any fingerprints.
Exactly.
And this is especially important for the Democrats that are in the supermajority, because they, of course, they have the speakers in charge of all the policy in your house, and then all of the committee chairs are Democrats, and they're a supermajority, and so if they're going to kill bills, these are the people they have to sit across the table from in their caucus lunch, and they don't want to have a lot of hard feelings over that. So the suspense file is an opportunity for them to do that, and for their Republican colleagues as well. They can kill their bills without there being too many hard feelings. And it plays that role really well. One of the things from a policy standpoint that I think a number of lobbyists were looking at, including myself on behalf of one of my clients, the landscape contractors, were the AI bills. And there were a lot of AI bills introduced this year, most of those sponsored by different labor groups. Labor, of course, has a lot of concerns about artificial intelligence in terms of its impact on jobs. Yeah. But beyond the actual headcount and job impact, there's how's it going to affect the workplace? How's it going to affect how I do my job? How am I being observed and managed and supervised, and so on and so forth? So there are a lot of bills introduced, and some of them were very, very problematic and generated large coalitions in opposition. Some of those coalitions led by the Cal Chamber, and some of them led by other organizations. My client in this matter, or in this area, California Landscape Contractors, we weighed in publicly on about a dozen bills, and I'd say half of those were AI, for at least at this point in the process, and about half of those were AI bills. The main difference between the 2 houses that we saw is the Assembly actually stopped, or we use the term killed, several high-profile AI bills by some of your colleagues on the other side of the aisle. And in the Senate, they got through. They took amendments, but they pretty much still got through. So in your policy discussions in June and early July, you're going to see more AI discussion in your policy committees, because the Senate bills got through, while several of the more concerning Assembly AI bills were actually stopped. There were a couple that got through. But we were really pleased to see that common sense prevailed in some of these employment decisions because, as you know, and as your constituents know, it's hard enough to be an employer in California, let alone having a new layer of regulations over how you manage the workplace. And then even more important than that, it's creating a whole series of new opportunities for trial lawyers to file lawsuits and sue employers because they're not hitting this particular element in the labor code or that one and so on and so forth. So
Right.
It's a big deal. I think we'll see more of it as time goes on. Labor never stops trying to get their way. And so I think it's going to continue to be a fight.
Yeah, no, I can't remember the number, but there was over 40 or 50 AI bills introduced this year. I mean, it is just it's a substantial amount, and obviously, I think there's some reasonable conversations going on about how we need to like prepare for the future of artificial intelligence. But then there's also a lot of bills that are really trying to regulate something we don't even fully understand yet.
Yeah.
Something that's actually probably going to hinder development and technology in California, which could be an issue. It's really all about striking the right balance. And I think the question is, do these bills strike that balance or not? I'm hoping some of the ones that failed or were held on suspense were some of the ones that didn't strike as good of a balance.
I think I agree with you, and I think you're right about that. I think those are some of the ones that got held. I would just add, so I completely agree. It's about striking the right balance. Everybody wants employees to be protected appropriately in the workplace. The problem with some of these bills and the difficulty in trying to legislate in this area is when you put a new rule or requirement or regulation in place to try to protect employees, are there unintended consequences that would stop the employer from otherwise utilizing appropriate mechanisms for managing their business? And so how you define AI and how you determine AI impacts on employees really matters, because if you end up roping in other management techniques, routine standard software that heretofore wasn't considered artificial intelligence, and all of a sudden you say you can't use that to process your payroll, that's a problem.
Yeah.
And those are the things that we have to really take a very close look at as we're going to regulate in this area.
Absolutely. So just to recap, I think you kind of mentioned this, but you were right. Yeah, 332 measures considered in the Senate, 637 considered in the Assembly.
Yeah.
It looks like about 90 were held on suspense in the Senate, and about 27%, and 242 were due pass, and then you had 169 held on suspense in the Assembly, about a 26% kill rate. But, interestingly, so this was my first experience as the vice chair, and I wanted to read every bill, which is sort of a problem that I have. And so I had those 637 measures in a binder. I actually always do digital, but this is one time where I told my staff, like,
how many binders?
It was
2 binders?
It was actually 2 binders, but the first one was, about this thick. It was one of the biggest ones you could possibly find. I was like, how did you guys even have a binder that big?
I remember
But it was a couple different binders, and it was funny. My colleagues were making fun of me because I just kept carrying it around with me everywhere I went. Because if I had a few minutes, I would just flip through a few more bills. And at the end, it was actually really interesting. I will say, it gives you a lot more perspective on what's coming to the floor. So it really prepares me better for the votes in a couple weeks here. But it was a really fascinating experience, and really highlighted just how many bills we actually have in this building. And honestly, it's probably too many.
So not to put you on the spot, but since I used to do that staff work, how do you feel you were staffed, not necessarily by your personal staff, but by your caucus staff? And how was it working with the chair and her staff?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. So for my staff, obviously, it was their first time going through this as well. I think my team did a fantastic job, getting me all the information I needed. I had interns. I've got a lot of interns right now that were frantically putting these binders together for a couple days. It was pretty great. And my team did a great job. My caucus staff also did a fantastic job providing, a lot of the analyses and everything for all these bills. But, working with the chair's office, Assemblywoman Buffy Wicks obviously has been around for a long time. And it was honestly very fantastic in terms of, we didn't always get the results we wanted, right? She didn't always kill the bills that I wanted her to kill. So I actually, when I met with her, I asked her, here's some bills that we find really problematic and would love to be held on suspense. And then here's some bills we'd like to pass. We didn't always get everything that we wanted. I think that's pretty typical of this process.
You got some of it.
But we got a lot. We killed some bad bills. I think we passed some really good bills. And I think most importantly, the dialogue was open. She was obviously willing to meet with me and listen. And
that's great.
We have a good working relationship. So I think it was a good start. And we'll see what happens to these bills on the floor.
All right.
With that, let's see. Last story I wanted to mention, just because it's one of my favorite topics that I always like to talk about, is there was a big new update on the Capitol Annex Project. Interestingly, there was, and we'll put a link in the notes with more information, but there was actually a new management of the project. They actually got rid of the old project manager and brought in someone new a few months ago. And this was sort of the first big project update that we've seen from that new management. Not a lot of good news. I guess $98 million or so over budget is what is now being projected. Remember that original budget was $1.1 billion. So $98 million over is somewhat problematic. They're claiming that they're not going to come back to the legislature for more money. I'm not quite sure how that's going to work, but that is sort of the current plan. Now, the one thing that I found really interesting is the rumor is that they're also abandoning the visitor center on the West Steps, which is a part of the project that I've been opposed to for a very long time.
Are they doing that for cost savings, or are they doing that for some political reason?
So I think there are some political reasons, because I've been talking a long time about preserving the West Steps, but I think most of it is cost savings. I think they're out of money. That was going to be a big chunk of additional costs, and it's an easy way for them to just cut costs there and put it into the overages in the main annex building. But I think it's really interesting because they're getting rid of a pretty big part of the project with the visitor center, and the budget is still going up, which I think says that they're way over budget. But anyway, I didn't know if you had any thoughts on that story.
Well, so I'm following it too, perhaps not as closely as you. A couple of thoughts, just from the outside looking in, and it has been pretty opaque, so it's not that clear of a view. But it really does seem that a lot of this over the last 3 or 4 years has been highly staff-driven and not necessarily being driven by elected officials. And whether it be on the governor's staff or the legislature, I'm not sure who's carrying the bigger stick. But I think that it's a concern, the lack of information sharing. If it were not for Ashley Zavala, right? I'm not sure we'd know anything about what was going on. I wish we had 5 more journalists like her, male and female, of course, doing that type of work. There just aren't enough people asking questions.
Totally.
I'm concerned about the costs. I'd make one observation here. If the governor, any governor, it could be a Republican governor or Democrat governor, but any future governor were to push the legislature authorization for a new office building, a new state office building, and got the funding appropriated for it, and had a general outline of what it was going to be, and then once they got down to the nitty-gritty of it, had their executive staff, the governor's executive staff, issue a series of non-disclosure agreements, NDAs, and made everybody that was going to touch this thing, including members of the legislature, sign an NDA, and then proceeded into the procurement process, finding and letting contracts for the builders and so on and so forth, and wasn't publishing information about what was going on and how it was going and what it was costing and where are the change orders and how much is all this costing. If some governor did that for a state office building and kept the legislature as an institution, as a body, in the dark, as much as your colleagues and the public have been kept in the dark on this project, there'd be hell to pay. Your colleagues on both sides of the aisle would be raising hell. And the minority party would probably have the loudest voice, but I'm sure that the majority party would be as well, because that's not the right way to build a public project.
Correct.
And so I think they've violated a lot of rules here. I think they've set some really bad precedents. I think the use of NDAs in a public project process is really unacceptable.
Agree.
And I'd love to hear more Democrats who control the policy apparatus in the legislature speak up in opposition to that. I just don't think it's right.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So you mentioned Ashley Zavala. She sat down with the two chairs of the Rules Committee this week, or last week, I should say, about the new update. And it's worth a watch. I'll try to find it and put it in the notes. John Laird and Blanca Pacheco.
Blanca Pacheco.
And it was a very uncomfortable interview. I will say it was not a friendly interview, which is fine with me. But it was, you know, they were it seemed very uncomfortable answering these questions. And
they shouldn't be.
And that's the frustrating part. It's like, just answer, you know, I think it would be much easier if everyone was just upfront about what was going on with the projects.
Yeah.
I think because when you're not, it just raises more suspicion.
What are you hiding? What is it you don't want the public to know?
Yeah.
What are you hiding?
So I'll try to find that and put it in the show notes. I mean, I hear you. It's like, it's so frustrating. And, you know, I'm really glad you mentioned the NDAs because that is one of the most ridiculous parts of this project. At the beginning of this year, I actually introduced legislation that would void all of those NDAs, and it would also prohibit NDAs on a future public project. I've gotten a lot of bills through the legislative process this year. I've had one bill that has not been referred to committee.
Oh, your NDA bill
and it's the
never
NDA
even got
bill.
So not only did it not get set to be heard, but it never even got referred.
It never even got referred out of the Rules Committee, right? Which I think says a lot, right? And the irony of this is one of the I don't know if anyone's walked by the if you're in downtown Sacramento, you got to take a peek at the new annex because it's moving along pretty quickly.
Yeah.
But it's sort of this giant glass building. It doesn't really match the character of the historic Capitol. But one of the reasons they went with glass is because they wanted it to reflect the transparency of government and how we need to be transparent. I just find that so incredibly ironic given the fact that everyone in the project signed an NDA, and it's quite literally been one of the least transparent projects in the history of California. So
we need less virtue signaling and more actual transparency. That's what we need.
100%. So frustrating, but I was honestly glad to see at least some sort of update on this. The new opening timeline for this new building is going to be October of 2027, which is just over a year away. They've spent up to this point $632 million of that $1.1 billion and expect to go a little bit over. But I think we need to keep holding their feet to the fire and making sure that, you know, we're finding ways to stay within budget on this. It's a little late to stop this project at this point if anyone's walked by it recently. But I do think it's important that the public knows what they're paying for.
100%.
Yeah. So
100%.
So more, you know, that's the story that never dies. I've been talking about this building for 4 years. And yeah, it's been pretty interesting. So let's dive into the budget.
Okay.
And, you know, I think to start, well, I'll just start by reading a couple very basic facts about the budget, and then I'll kick it to you on sort of your initial thoughts. But essentially, the governor's new state budget proposes $349.4 billion in state spending, which is $500 million higher than the January budget that he proposed, $246.6 billion in general fund revenues, 95.6 in special funds, and 7.3 billion in bond funds. There's also a number of federal spending in that budget as well. In terms of the comparison, the current year spending increases by excuse me, by 8.1 billion, and the budget year spending decreases by 1.7 billion. Based on what you saw from the governor last week and what you've read about the budget, what are your initial takeaways from this May revise, and how does it compare to what you thought in January?
I'm glad you asked the second part of that question because I want to address that right away. When I was here in January, I think the way our time together ended was me making a pretty strong statement.
You did,
which was, I think I try to quote myself here saying something to the extent of, there's really only one way the revenue estimates can go in the May revise, and that's down.
That is what you said.
And if I'm wrong, I'll come back and admit it. So I'm going to admit to you and to your listeners and to anybody that cares, I was definitely wrong. Of course, the revenue estimates and actual revenue collected to date by any measurement or estimate are way higher.
Yeah.
I think we need to talk about that because there's some really important implications. Mm-hmm. But you know, the last time we saw a revenue surge like this, and I'm going to set aside the COVID thing, because what happened during COVID was a mirage, and we've talked about that. We may touch on it again because that's what really set the stage for these ongoing structural budget problems. I don't want to digress to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can talk about it at the end. But setting aside the COVID situation where the governor came out and said there was a $97 billion surplus, which turned out to be, I'm not suggesting the governor knowingly lied, but he got way too loose with his facts, and his Department of Finance let him down. And I'm an ex-finance person, so I like those folks. I'm not trying to criticize them. But of course, that was all a mirage. It never happened. So you set that aside. The last time we saw this was during the run-up to the dot-com collapse. And Gray Davis, when he was governor, was his first or second full year in office, was sitting on this huge surplus of cash. And he made some of the same mistakes that Governor Newsom and the legislature made a few years ago when they committed the state to a pathway of overspending. But let's talk about some of the facts as we know it.
Yeah.
The Newsom administration's revenue estimates, and when we talk about the budget estimate, remember there's a past year, a current fiscal year, which is the 25-26 year, which ends June 30th, and then there's the budget year, which starts July 1st. Some people say, well, how is there a change in the past year? Well, there's even when the fiscal year ends, there's still a lot of settling up that happens. There's cash that comes in that they have to assign. Was this a 24-25 fiscal year thing, or was it a 25-26? So there are adjustments that are made in the past year. When you look at the administration's revenue estimate in the May revised as compared to just 5 months ago in January, the budget revenues are up an astounding $16 billion.
Wow.
And in January, they were already up dramatically over from what the nonpartisan ledge analysts had said just a couple months earlier in November in their end of 2025 fiscal update. That's partly why I sat here and told you there's no way the revenues are going higher. We already thought the numbers were looking really rosy, but in fact, they have gone higher. What's causing that? Almost all, I'd say at least 85% of this big run-up in revenue is on the personal income tax side. Remember, to the state general fund, and that's what we're talking about here is the general fund. The general fund is a fund that receives the proceeds of taxes. So we're talking about personal income taxes, sales tax, corporate taxes, some other miscellaneous taxes, insurance premiums, and things like that. So almost all of this is personal income tax. And then within the personal income tax, 90% of that run-up is in what we call estimated payments. And these are payments that very wealthy people are making when they exercise stock options and they get stock compensation and various things tied to the stock market, as well as business ownerships, buying and selling businesses, and so on. But a huge component of this run-up in revenue is due to higher capital gains estimates and estimated payments. Those are being driven by the huge run-up in the stock market. I think the S&P 500 is up almost 50%. It's up over 50%. Estimated payments to what I was just talking about from wealthy people to the Franchise Tax Board are up over 50% year over year, just compared to last year, okay? The stock market is up 75%, the revenues overall are being driven by a roaring stock market, and the stock market is up almost 75% in the last 3 years.
It's incredible.
What's driving this?
Yeah.
Artificial intelligence. There are 4 companies that are responsible for the lion's share of this huge increase in stock valuation and stock compensation to employees. And leading the charge, of course, is NVIDIA, which is the world's leader in artificial intelligence technology and in chip making and so on. So because these companies are domiciled here in California and because they're generating hundreds of billions of dollars in profit, and they're paying their employees in these options and stock incentives and stock compensation, it's generating huge amounts of revenue, and that's how. And that revenue is not collected through payroll tax deductions. That's collected through what we call these estimated payments. These are payments that folks have to make every 3 months if they're if a certain class of employee, or if they're business owners. I have to make estimated payments as I'm a business owner. So that's what's going on, and that's great. You can say that's great. California's got a great technology sector. It's generating a lot of revenue. We can use this revenue to pay for services people need. But there's some problems here which we need to get into, which the analyst talks about and which others, your colleagues, have been talking about, some of their comments that we're going to hear more. And that is, this is starting to look a bit like a bubble. So, a stock bubble. So the good news for Governor Newsom is on his way out at the end of his second term, he's sitting on a plethora of cash, which makes his life much easier than it would be otherwise. His challenge, since he wants to run for president, is he wants to leave the state in condition where when he's out in Iowa, next year trying to, sell the California miracle, he wants to be able to say that the state's finances are in good shape. And I think what the analyst has said and what other people a lot smarter than I am are saying is that this budget doesn't hit that standard. It doesn't do that. And let's talk about why.
Yeah.
Well, we'll talk about why in a moment. So as I normally do, I want to talk about some of the good things.
Let's talk good stuff.
There's some good stuff here. And we've already talked about the fact that the administration's revenue estimate's up over $16 billion. What does that mean from a practical standpoint? Well, Prop 98, which is the constitutional funding guarantee for schools, the Prop 98 funding is up over $6.4 billion just since January.
Yeah.
$6.4 billion. And what that means is that the per pupil funding has gone up dramatically as well. But it's up $6.4 billion since January. And if you look at the last 3 years of budgets, Prop 98 is up over $28 billion. What does this mean? It means that our public schools are being funded really well.
Yeah.
Everybody will always tell you they need more money. Everybody can always use more money to do more good projects. There's no disputing that, but they're being funded really well. Based upon the Prop 98 funding that's in the budget now as a result of this huge revenue run-up, the per pupil spending is now going to be, when you approve this budget, it's going to be at a record high. This is just from Prop 98, of $21,013 per student. And when you include all fund sources, federal funds and other fund sources, it goes as high as $28,000 per pupil when you account for all fund sources. So this is a big deal. It's good for our public schools. Let's hope that they are good stewards of these resources and they use them well and do good things to help our kids learn. Of course, one of the important funding mechanisms in public education is the local control funding formula. I sat here and told you in January, I thought one of the good things about the budget was that they were going to have a 2.4% COLA, which was great. Now in the May revise, they're sitting on a pile more cash. That COLA is now being increased to almost 2.9%. And then in addition to that, the governor is now proposing an additional, and that's a statutory requirement, that they either can or can't do. They can always in lieu of the statute if they didn't have the money, but it's a statutory requirement. But in addition to that, the governor is doing a discretionary distribution on top of that, which will bring the COLA distribution to public schools up to 4.31%. This, of course, going to K-12 and community colleges. So they're being well funded. And then as far as higher education goes, there's California State University, University of California, their COLAs are being fully funded. There are no really difficult fiscal areas there for our higher education institutions. So all of this is really good. I'm sure Governor Newsom will take a lot of credit for it. Any governor would, so you can't blame him for that. But honestly, a lot of that is just formula driven. Kind of like how the governor always talks about how California has the fourth largest economy in the world.
Yes,
Well,
very often.
Yeah, there's 39 million people living here. It's by definition, you're going to have one of the largest economies in the world. You've got to still talk about unemployment and crime and homelessness and all the other challenges that you face. So these are all really good things. So then the question is, all right, well, that all sounds pretty good, Mr. Sheehy. What's the big beef about this budget? Well, here's some of the things that, if I may transition to some of the concerns. We've touched on some of them. So
I've got a few too. I might chime in.
Okay, perfect. So there's this huge revenue increase. I said $16 billion over the 3-year budget forecast window. You would think, with that big of a surge in revenues, and in the January version of the budget, it was a big write-up in revenue, which is why I said I thought it was the governor had rose-colored eyeglasses on.
Yeah.
You would think with all this money pouring into the franchise tax board here in Sacramento, for you and your colleagues to appropriate and spend and so on and so forth, you would think that you'd be putting more money into the rainy day fund
100%.
and building the state's reserves for a time when all that money wasn't rolling in. You would think that. You would think that you'd be taking all that cash and paying down this giant wall of debt, which we'll talk about more in a moment. When Governor Newsom came into office, Jerry Brown left him with a total, all-in, full-stop, $2 billion of debt across the board, budget debt. I'm not talking about long-term bonds and so on, but I'm talking about having borrow from programs and funds and so on. We're now at $30 billion since Newsom became governor, and his budget will add 4 more to that.
30 billion
plus 4 more.
Wow.
Because he's not funding the there's a Prop 98 because the revenues have gone so high in the current year. That drives the Prop 98 guarantee higher, and the governor and legislature have a choice to go ahead and fund that through an appropriations bill in the current year that you would take up and pass and raise the guarantee, the funding, or you can defer that. And if you defer that, that frees up that cash to spend on other things. You have to pay it eventually, but you can defer it. Despite all these billions of dollars in additional cash rolling in, the governor's deferring that Prop 98 payment in the current year. Okay,
I did notice that.
He's passing that on to his successor. Despite this huge run up in revenues, the way the governor balances the budget in the budget year, meaning the fiscal year that starts July 1st of 2026, the way he balances it, I mean, big picture, without the little nits and nats we'll get to in a moment, is he draws down the state reserves by $20 billion.
It's unbelievable.
When we sat here last year talking about the May revise, the governor's plan, if you looked at all of the state reserves, the budget stabilization account, the special fund for economic uncertainty, all these different, for some people that aren't budget people, sort of arcane fund names and fund reserves. But you've added up all the reserves in the budget a year ago, as we were looking at the May revise, it was almost $49 billion. This budget in front of you, if enacted, as the governor has requested, would leave the state's total reserves $19 billion.
Wow.
19. So you can see what's happening here is that what Governor Newsom is doing is big picture now, is the budget is balanced, the budget he's presented is balanced, but how is it balanced? It's balanced with one-time solutions. When you take money out of a reserve, you can only take that dollar out once. You can't take it out twice.
Yeah.
So he's taking $20 billion out of your budget reserves to balance his budget in the 6-7 fiscal year, the budget year, and to carry over $10 more billion for his successor in the 27-28 fiscal year, of which he'll be governor for half of it because he doesn't leave office till next January.
Yep.
So he's doing all this. I'm just going to be political for a moment and not sort of fiscal. He's doing all this so that when he walks away, he can say, I left California in good shape. Well, how do you define good shape? Well, the budget was balanced. How did you balance it? Well, I pulled a lot of money out of the reserves and propped everything up with it.
Yeah.
What's the problem with that? The problem with that is that even by forget about what the nonpartisan legislative analyst says, even by the Department of Finance's own numbers, finance, who are the fiscal advisors to the governor, that when you get to budget year +1, +2, and +3, by finance's numbers, you're going to have $10 billion plus deficits every year. What does that mean? That means we have a structural budget problem that is upon us. What does that mean? It means when you look at all the things that government does, whether it be public safety and correctional programs, providing health and welfare benefits to the poor, disabled, and needy in the state of California, all of the different things that we use general fund money for, it means that we don't collect enough personal income tax, corporate tax, and sales tax to pay for it. The famous, what I, at least on this podcast, made famous, the fish mouth, is not going to close. The long-term expenditure trend, the long-term revenue trend, my lower hand will never meet up with the long-term expenditure trend, my upper hand. And they've been able to get away with it the last couple of years because they've had a big influx of cash. And great, so they haven't had to make a lot of hard decisions. But what he's doing here is, instead of forcing the legislature, once again, to make some really tough decisions, whether they be tax increases or spending, it doesn't have to always be budget cuts, but whether it's on the tax revenue side of the ledger or the let's cut program side of the ledger, he's not getting the state's long-term expenditures in alignment with its long-term revenues. And he is, in fact, papering it over this year by pulling huge amounts of money out of the budget reserves to do it.
Yeah, it's hugely concerning, and so I do see that here. I think it says my sheet says $9.6 to $13.9 billion multi-year budget deficits, which are huge deficits, and that doesn't even include future revenue projections or anything like that. Right?
Well, here's where it gets worse. So your numbers, we're working off the same numbers here, 10 to 13 billion. But here, so you can say, okay, the state's had $50 billion problems before, and 10 to 13 billion, no big deal. But remember, This is with the underpinning of the administration's revenue estimate.
Correct.
Not only do you have this huge run-up in revenue that's generating this surplus now we're talking about the May revise, okay? And like I already said, notwithstanding the fact there's all this cash coming in, instead of socking it away in a rainy day fund, the governor's pulling money out of the rainy day fund to balance the budget. But if you look at the underpinnings of this, the forecast on this budget, they assume that the stock market will continue to grow at a modest pace in the budget year, next year.
Yeah.
Well, and let's hope that it does. I mean, I've got money invested in mutual funds.
We all
and
want that,
exchange.
right?
Yeah, we all want that. But if we are in a situation that is anywhere near what we experienced 20 years ago with the dot-com, or 25 years ago with the dot-com situation, if there's any retraction, and I mean any retraction, even a 10% correction in the stock market, that's going to send California's revenues down the drain very, very rapidly, and you're going to go from a $10 to $13 billion structural budget problem. All of a sudden, you could be looking at a 50, 60, 70. The nonpartisan legislative analysts even said, at current year and budget year combined scenario, you could be looking at $100 billion. I mean, now you're talking about a crisis situation. Now, Governor Newsom is fortunate. He hasn't had to face that crisis situation.
Correct.
And hopefully the next governor won't have to either. But the job of the executive and hopefully of the legislature is to position the state such that if and when that does happen, and there are those out there saying it's not if, it's when. Having been wrong last year, I'm not going to make a prediction. But the point is that there's tremendous exposure here. And this isn't Tom Sheehy saying this.
Yeah.
This is the nonpartisan legislative analyst, very well respected. And they are saying in black and white, the governor's making a huge mistake here.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to be difficult for the majority party and the legislature to go against the governor on this, because it's going to require a lot of really, really tough decisions.
Agreed.
So we've talked about this. I think the other thing that is
and just real quick to cut in on that, to follow up on that, you know, the nonpartisan legislative analyst's office is saying the market's overheated, the state's tax structure is going to soften at some point in the near future. I think, you know, Newsom's hope is really more of self-interest and short-term, where, you know, maybe that's just not going to be his problem.
Right.
But I think ultimately, I think you're right. An executive is supposed to, he should be trying to set up a good budget picture for his successor, whoever that may be. Instead, I think his successor is going to inherit a very risky budget situation.
100%. And if you look at what Jerry Brown did, the last governor, who also happened to be the same political party as Governor Newsom, Jerry Brown did exactly what you just said. He paid down the wall of debt. He made sure that the state's long-term, at least in terms of their forecast, revenues and expenditures were in alignment. I mean, Jerry Brown handed over a really good, really healthy, really good fiscal picture to Governor Newsom, and he really benefited from it in his first term. It wasn't until the dot-com bubble and his proclamation of his announcement of the $97 billion surplus, and then allowing the legislature and the executive branch to just start spending like drunken sailors, and then the money never showed up. That's what caused the problem we're in right now.
Yeah.
But a couple other things, you know, we mentioned this wall of debt. That's a huge issue.
Yeah.
It's not very sexy to talk about, because these are, you know, in the last several years when you had me on your podcast and we talked about the state's fiscal situation, we talked about how was the state actually balancing the books. And your longtime listeners will recall we talked about a lot of things like fund shifts, delays of programs, changes in accounting methods. All of these things were one term. They generated real budget savings, but they were one-time fixes.
Yeah.
So they didn't have the benefit of an ongoing, lasting effect. And in the case where they were borrowing money from special funds and borrowing money from different programs, they were creating a lot of debt that was ultimately have to be paid off. And as I mentioned earlier, when Newsom came into office, he had $2 billion in budget debt that Jerry Brown left. Jerry Brown did a great job paying down the wall of debt that Schwarzenegger left him. And Schwarzenegger had a pretty rough time his second term in office. That was when I was with him.
Yeah.
I'd like to think it was a little bit less rough with me there. Nevertheless, it was rough. But unfortunately, this governor has run that wall of debt all the way up to $30 billion. And then if his budget is approved as presented to you and your colleagues, it's going to add another $4 billion to it because of the deferral and the Prop 98 funding, recognizing that, which he's going to have to recognize. And so this wall of debt is going to have to be paid off by the next governor. And he's leaving the next governor a $34 billion wall of debt, not a $2 billion.
Incredible.
So it's a black and white picture. One other thing, obviously, because if I didn't mention this, I think some of your listeners would wonder what's going on with this discussion. They didn't talk about the tax increases.
Which there are some. Yeah.
This is the first time since I've been on your show where the single biggest component of his quote unquote solutions, and it is a solution, to the budget problems we're facing are new taxes. And he has three big new tax increases.
Yeah.
He's greatly expanding sales tax on certain types of software procurements and sales of software. Purely customized software development is still not going to be taxed, but basically for the non-custom software, regardless of how it's delivered, it could be downloaded, some consultant could show up and install it for you in your office, but a lot of software sales that were not being taxed up until now are now going to be taxed, which is a huge change in the technology area. That's going to generate about $1.8 billion annually, not quite that much in the first year. That's going to generate about $450 million in the first year, and then almost $1 billion annually to the state. It's also going to generate another $1 billion in tax income to local government. But in addition to that, he's also greatly limiting business tax credits. Under current law, big companies, small companies, any company that got tax credits, they could use all of them in any particular tax year. Even if it wiped out all of their tax life, they could use all their credits. Under the governor's proposal before you, and that you're going to be asked to vote on, and this is a tax increase, it'll be a 2/3 vote, he's going to limit that to only 1/2. So no matter how many credits you have, you can only use half of them, or $5 million, whichever number is greater. That'll protect really small businesses, but when you get to the medium-sized and larger businesses, this is going to be a big tax increase on them, particularly in the technology area where they have a lot of these credits. Finally, he's reviving on a permanent basis the MCO tax. And this, of course, is a tax on health plans. And you're probably, I'm sure you're aware that that tax is due to expire at the end of 2026 calendar year. But rather than letting that tax expire, the governor's re-upping it to the tune of about $2.3 billion. This matters because that tax will get passed on to your constituents that have to buy health insurance and have to make co-payments and have money deducted from their checks for their employee share of it. And it's one thing to continue the MCO tax, and he's using it to offset the cost of the Medi-Cal program because those costs have been skyrocketing. But what does that mean as far as provider rates go? The whole premise of the MCO tax a couple years ago that was sold to you and your colleagues was vote for this tax increase. We'll be able to draw down more federal money. We'll be able to make more resources available to providers to keep access open to the poor and needy in this state, right? Because a lot of doctors won't do Medi-Cal because it doesn't pay them enough, and they'd rather take non-Medi-Cal patients. Well, none of this $2.3 billion in his MCO tax proposal is going to go to provider rates. None of it.
Which is incredibly frustrating.
Yeah, and the reason why, and one of the main drivers, as we talked about in January, why the Medi-Cal costs are going up so dramatically is because of all the non-documented citizens in this state.
Which I believe this budget still includes $11 billion
100%.
to cover.
Over $11 billion in general fund money is being spent on men and women that were not born in this country and were not naturalized in this country, didn't come into this country through the normal legal processes.
Right.
And that's money that could be allocated to other areas for folks that are well documented and living here as citizens. Yeah. So that's a concern.
It's certainly a huge commitment to make when you have all of these other budgetary challenges, for sure. A few other things that I've sort of highlighted in terms of the governor's spending priorities, in addition to that $11 billion, there's $50 million. This is one that I think a lot of folks actually support. In short-term support for hospitals in immediate significant financial distress. This is a challenge in a lot of more rural communities, not so much in my district per se, but in definitely a lot of rural hospitals throughout the state that I know a lot of my colleagues have been paying attention to. Retains the $1 billion annually for the high-speed rail, something that I continue to raise concerns about because, this is a project that quite literally has no other funding and will likely never happen with $1 billion a year, and yet we're still throwing quite a bit of money at it every year. There is a $2.4 billion increase in special education funding, which is something I've advocated for a long time. Was definitely glad to see that. This one was really interesting, going back to our Capitol Annex conversation. $14.3 million to begin the pre-construction reconfiguration of the swing space, which is the current building that we're currently housed in, the legislature's currently housed in, for getting it ready for after we move back into the Capitol Annex. I thought that was a pretty interesting note there. There's this one drives me insane. $141.9 million from the state emergency telephone number account to redo the next generation 911 system that we've already redone. So we've already spent $450 million on a system that OES has a lot of problems with. I proposed an audit of that process so that we could see if we could salvage some of that system and save taxpayers some money.
Did you propose that audit to JLAC?
I did.
Did they approve it?
And actually, interesting note, as of last week, which was kind of the last chance for us to get on the next hearing, it was not put on the docket. And so that's 2 hearings in a row where it was not approved for the...
Let me get this straight. Where the state's wasting hundreds of millions of dollars and can't seem to get a 911 system technology update done properly, where hundreds of millions of dollars are not properly accounted for, you make a request to JLAC and they turn you down, yet they approve an audit to go after a local education board because they don't like their policy decisions.
Correct.
Is that the right way for the state auditor to be directed to work in the state?
You know, honestly, it's really upsetting because, again, even in this case with the audit committee, I think we're just focused on the wrong priorities. And we're focused on the political priorities, not the actual fiscal priorities that affect taxpayers. So, I mean, this is, this $141 million... is in addition to the $450 million we've already spent, that apparently we're just going to trash that system and build an entirely new system. And this is just the beginning, by the way. It's going to cost more than $141 million.
Of course.
So,
of course.
I find that budget item particularly problematic. Now, there is a colleague of mine on the other side of the aisle that still has a bill moving through the legislature that calls for an audit of the 911 system.
Okay.
I'm going to keep supporting her efforts. I don't care who gets the credit on this.
Right.
I just want to see it get done. And so if we can have a bipartisan effort here, I'm all about it. Let's do that. I've had conversations with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, and they agree that it should be audited. But this audit still sits, off the agenda. So we'll see what happens with that. But I really hope that the legislature can negotiate out this number. So that we can actually... move forward.
Well, that's yet just a current example of something. If you look at the history in the state over the last 30 years, there have been unfortunately, many large IT projects. And this is an IT project, updating the 911 system. Many large IT projects that have run have become shipwrecked. I mean, whether you're talking about the state's payroll system with the state controller's office.
A fiscal, right? Yeah,
which is still being held together with bubblegum and bailing wire. You look at fiscal. There's a number of different, the DMV has a history, they've gotten their act together in the last decade or so. But this, unfortunately, is illustrative for whatever reason, and there are many of them, why the state has a very difficult time doing large IT projects, and this is another example of that.
It is another example in a very long list, unfortunately. Last thing I was going to mention, the governor really hung his hat on this tax cut for small businesses, right?
Yes.
But I just want to mention, so he proposed a tax cut for new businesses coming into California. Usually you need to pay an $800 fee to set up your LLC. Now, that's the minimum franchise tax.
It's called excuse me. It's called you're right. A minimum, I didn't know if you were going to say it. It's the minimum franchise tax.
The minimum franchise tax, $800 to start your new business, which, by the way, I'm pretty sure is the highest in the entire country, but it's definitely one of the highest, and it's far higher than most other states. Cutting that to $400 only.
Yes.
What a deal. Yes. For 3 years.
Yes.
And he made this big pronouncement about this, look what we're doing for small business. Now, look, I'm all about it. I support the cut, right? But Republicans have proposed for years to eliminate it altogether.
Okay, let me get this.
Reduce it substantially.
Let's be clear about how the governor is helping small business. On the one hand, he's proposing to save them $400 on the minimum franchise tax fee. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. I agree with you. It should just be eliminated. Republicans have been arguing for that for a long time. And the Republicans are right about that. But on the other hand, what's he saying? We're going to prevent you from using millions of dollars in business tax credits that you otherwise would be lawfully able to use to offset your income. And so which is a better deal for the small business, saving $400 here or having to pay millions of dollars more there?
Yeah.
It's the type of duplicity coming from this governor that is going to really hurt him when he's running for national office, because people will notice and people will talk about it. One other thing, I know we're coming to close to the end of our time, but one more programmatic thing, and I just want to make a note.
Please.
Not only did the January version of the budget not include the proper funding for Prop 36, but the May revision doesn't put a dime in for it.
I was going to mention that too, yeah.
Why does, well, first of all, why? I don't know. I guess the governor's holding a grudge. He was publicly against Prop 36, which of course was trying to affix some of the mistakes made in our criminal justice system from the Safe Neighborhood Act, which didn't make our neighborhood safer, as you know. And he campaigned against it, yet it passed with a pretty wide margin. A lot of Democrats as well as Republicans voted for that. So I guess
over 50% in every county.
I guess in spite, he decided not to fund it, and the May revise, he's still not funding it. Why does this matter? Well, you know, it is the law. And so, you know, district attorneys and the courts and police departments, probation departments, everybody that works in the criminal justice system, they need the resources to implement Prop 36.
100%.
And this governor is denying it. I can't understand why he would do that. That's going to hurt him in his run for national office.
It absolutely is. It's another thing that I think is just a complete, you know, it's incredibly disappointing. And for those that, you know, I always have to remind people what Prop 36 is, because most people know, but there might be some listeners out there that may no longer remember, but it was a voter-approved initiative not that long ago to really go after retail theft by holding people more accountable. And how do they do that? They do that through treatment-mandated felonies. Exactly. By restoring those. This funding would provide mental health and drug treatment programs to courts, probation, and which is required for individuals charged with treatment-mandated felonies. If you don't fund, if our DAs, our law enforcement, our courts don't get the dollars that they need to implement Prop 36, it's not going to be nearly as effective. And I think the governor, honestly, in some ways, wants to see it fail. And I hope the legislature pushes back on this and puts some money in there.
I just, you know, Josh, I just don't understand this one. You would think, you know, if you go back to Prop 13, okay, the Gann initiative, Howard Jarvis and Paul Gann. Governor Brown was very vocally against that initiative when it was on the ballot. He campaigned against it. He said it was a bad idea. You know, I know this goes back to ancient history, but here's the point. When that passed with an overwhelming majority of the voters in California, Governor Brown, to his credit, he pivoted and he said, all right, this is the will of the voters. I'm going to help implement it. And now I'm all for reducing waste in government and trying to cut taxes even further. That's to his credit. Governor Newsom came, and I don't understand why he was against Prop 36. All of law enforcement was for it. People were tired of seeing people come out of Target and different stores with shopping carts full of merchandise that they had no intention of paying for, and they'd never be arrested. They'd never do any time. People were sick of that. That's why Prop 36 passed. I don't understand why the governor was against it to begin with. I think it was a bad call on his part. But then once it passed, why didn't he do what Jerry Brown did, which was pivot, say, you know what, this is the will of the voters. We're going to implement this, and hopefully it will help drive our crime statistics down. And then he could have campaigned for future office, national or otherwise, as a crime fighter instead of somebody that's been trying to, you know, defund a very popular crime-fighting initiative as Prop 36 is. I just don't understand it.
No, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me either. So with that, so you mentioned shortchanging the Rainy Day Fund. The last note I wanted to mention on things he's not funding. He's also not putting any money toward fraud prevention or detection in our social programs, in the hospice system, in the California Community College financial aid system. All these systems where we've identified significant fraud and waste and abuse, no funding going into detecting or rooting that out. I think that's unfortunate. Had to make that note before we close out.
It is an outrage, and I think the reason for that is because he doesn't want to give the Trump administration any credit for
helping identify
it in the first place. And that, to me, that's cutting off your nose to spite your face.
I hear you. Well, hey, Tom, as always, we're out of time, but I really appreciate you coming on. It's always enlightening when you come on to talk about the budget, and it's been great having you on as a reoccurring guest.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the
opportunity. Any final thoughts? I'll let you close here.
Thanks for the opportunity to have the discussion, and I just wish you and your colleagues on both sides of the aisle, I wish you good luck, and I wish you a lot of patience and perseverance in trying to craft a state budget. And I hope that you're able to make some improvements, at least at the margins, over what the governor has proposed. There's some good things in the governor's May revise. I hope all those get enacted. But as far as it relates to this fish mouth that I always bring up and the long-term revenues and expenditures, I hope you're able to do what the legislative analyst has suggested and make more permanent changes to the budget, which will make California's future fiscal stability much better than this particular plan in front of you will. So with that, I wish you well.
I appreciate it, Tom. For those that have notes or thoughts on the show, you can email pointoforderpod@gmail.com. Follow us at pointoforderpod on socials. You can also follow myself at Joshua_Hoover on X, and then Sheehy Strategy Group, where Tom is at. He's got some tweets up there as well on X at Sheehy Strategy. Tom, as always, it's a pleasure having you, and we'll see you again another day.
Looking forward to it. Thank you very much.
See you later.